All right, so I want to talk today about um, those aspects of Hume's philosophical psychology that's presented in Book Two that are relevant to his discussion of ethics in Book Three. And in order to set that up, right, we began last time by talking about some of the elements of Hume's conception of mind. So let's see. Uh, uh, so here's a diagram kind of summarizing what was going on. So we began with the generic category, uh, and the generic category uh, 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 was perceptions. And recall, perceptions were, whatever it was that could be set before the mind. Um, Now, these could be things like what we regard as perceptions, but also, emotions like love and hatred are perceptions in this sense. We saw these divided into impressions and ideas. The important point about that distinction was that impressions enter the mind, he says, with more force and vivacity than the ideas, which are faint copies of them. So force and vivacity, that's the thing that's distinguishing impressions of ideas. And we saw there were two categories of impressions of sensation. So sensory perceptions, right, and their objects count as impressions of sensation. And then we saw, besides impressions of sensation, we also had impressions of reflection. And these were things like emotions or desires or the will. Um, okay, so what I want to talk today about is I want to begin with this familiar image, okay? This image is familiar from philosophy, but it also plays a role in common sense thought, or as Hume might put it, it plays a role in the thought of the vulgar. Um, Now, among philosophers, the image dates back at least to Plato, although it plays an important role in Stoic thought. And the image is familiar in Hume's time as well. So Pascal, uh, who was rough contemporary of Hume, um, uh, uh, spoke of the combat of reason and the passions. Let's see. So there's Pascal pictured there. Um, And look, not only does this image of somehow reason and the passions being in combat with one another play a role in philosophical reflection on the determinants of the will and human action, but it plays a role in common sense thought. So, we talk, for example, of someone who, in the throes of violent emotions, are inclined to act contrary to their best interests as being out of their senses, right? The suggestion being that the operation of reason involving, as it were, the ability to recognize one's own interests and to act to promote it, if not promote it, at least not frustrate it, has been disordered, right, by the turbulence of some felt motion, okay? So this image of somehow reason and the passions being in combat with one another suggests a number of philosophical theses, right? None of these are really entailing, but rather they form a familiar syndrome of ideas. So uh, um, the image suggests, first of all, and fundamentally, that somehow that reason and the passions can both determine the will, okay? And what the conflict is over who gets to determine the will. Similarly, part of the picture is that passions can somehow oppose the termination of the will. And conversely, that reason can somehow oppose the passion's determination of the will. And then finally, right, implicit in this imagery, or often associated with it, is a claim about the nature of virtue, that reason ought to determine the will. Okay, so not only are passion and reason potential determinants of the will that can conflict, uh, but a really virtuous person is someone who allows reason to determine their will. And so if instead, right, the passions determine the will in opposition to reason's determination, well, then you would have a vicious character, and your action would be an example of vice and something blameworthy. Okay, so that's the picture. Now, I'm going on about this picture because uh, um, Hume is going to be fundamentally opposed to this familiar picture. Okay, so um, in particular, right, in opposing this tradition, he's going to claim that reason alone can never determine the will, and that reason alone can never oppose the passion's determination of the will. Now, this second claim, while distinct from the first, is really um, very quickly entailed by the first, at least in Hume's thought. And the reason for this is Hume thinks that the only way something can oppose the determination of the will is if it's itself a determinant of the will. And since by the first thesis, reason doesn't determine the will, it follows that reason can never oppose the passion's determination of the will. So, and really for Hume, these theses emerge from um, certain claims about the proper operation of reason. Okay, so let's begin by looking at how Hume thinks about reason, right? And according to Hume, right, there's really two operations of reason, right? So reason can demonstrate certain truths based upon the relations among ideas. Uh, and now, examples of this would be the truths of logic or arithmetic, according to Hume, are demonstrable. And when we demonstrate these truths, right, they're demonstrated on the basis of the relations among the certain ideas. Okay. Uh, the other thing that reason can do is to infer or render probable, right, the relation that the relation of cause and effect obtains between certain objects and events. Okay, uh, and that's it, right? These are the two functions of reason, according to Hume, right? To determine, to demonstrate certain truths on the basis of the relations among ideas, and to render probable, right, the relation of cause and effect among certain objects and events. Okay. Uh, according to Hume, reason admits of no further office. Those are the exclusively the two functions of reason. Now, I'm emphasizing that uh, because that's going to play a role in establishing these theses. Okay. So uh, now mathematics and beliefs about causal relations can have practical applications. Hume is under no illusion about this. Uh, Look, if you want to build a large and complex bridge, well, you might have to do some calculations, right? However, Hume thinks that that's only so if you have as your antecedent end a desire, right, to build a bridge, right? If you didn't have as your end to build a bridge, right, then these calculations wouldn't move you to do to build a bridge. So in general, right, um, uh, um, um, uh, uh, demonstrative reasoning and reasoning about cause and effect can influence our actions, but they only do so thanks to some antecedent end. And according to Hume, that antecedent end has to be given by a desire. Okay. Uh, okay. So here's where we're at. We've got a certain limited conception of reason. According to this limited conception of reason, reason only demonstrates certain truths or renders probable the relation of cause and effect between objects and events. And neither of these things can by themselves determine the will. Uh, and well, since those are the only functions, right? Since those are the only functions of reason, and those functions can't determine the will, it follows that reason can't determine the will, at least by itself, at least without the aid of some antecedent end provided by a desire. And since the operation of reasons can't determine the will alone, neither can it oppose the passion's determination of the will. Again, for Hume, in order for something to be able to oppose the passion's determination of the will, it itself must be a determinant of the will. And we've just seen a little argument that suggested that reason isn't a determination of the will. Um, Now, um, here's Hume. Allow me to read you a quote. He says, "We speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of combat of passion and of reason. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." Okay, so Hume is really being deliberatively provocative in his use of language here. So to those, right, who would lament reason's enslavement to the passions, Hume retorts that not only is reason a slave of the passion, but it ought only to be. Okay. Now, excuse me, this talk of reason being a slave of the passions, right, is again kind of shorthand for reason doesn't determine the will, nor can it oppose the passion's determination of the will. Um, uh, Now, um, interestingly, right, when earlier writers, for example, Spinoza, complains of reason's bondage to the passions, right? Those writers had in mind a specific model of slavery. In particular, they were thinking of the Egyptian enslavement of the ancient Hebrews, right? Hume has in inverting the Stoic lament, has sort of um, silently switched the operative historical model of slavery that's at work in this metaphor. In particular, when he claims that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, he has in mind the Roman enslavement of the educated Greeks. And just as the influence of the Greek slaves on their Roman masters was limited to educating them, uh, well, uh, reason's influence over the will is limited to educating the passions as to the presence of their objects and the causal means to their obtainment. So that's how Hume is thinking about these things. Um, all right, so look, what do we think about this argument? Well, I think there's a couple questions we can raise, right? We can wonder about how can Hume validly conclude that reason ought only to be a slave of the passions, right? Look, even if you thought his argument worked, right, and you thought that, uh, then it seems that what that argument established is that reason doesn't determine the will, nor does it oppose the passions determination of the will, and in that sense is the slave of the passions, but that it ought only to be, that's a further claim. What's the basis for the ought claim, right? That's what the first question is asking us. Uh, um, and there's also a question not only about the validity of establishing the ought claim, but there's also a question about how persuasive is this argument going to be for someone who endorses a different conception of reason than Hume's. Okay, so let's begin with the first question about this argument. Um, 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 Again, it seems that what follows from Hume's premises is the claim that reason is the slave of the passions. That it ought to be is a further claim, and what on earth is justifying the ought claim? So that's the worry. Well, I think that uh, Hume is both looking forward to the end of book 3 and looking backwards to the end of book 1 simultaneously. So I think you need to read this passage in the larger context of the treatise. So looking forward to the end of book 3, Hume is going to um, make the following sort of claim, right? So I've emphasized last time how Hume's project is primarily descriptive and explanatory. He's not trying to tell us what to do. He's not trying to justify morality nor persuade us to be virtuous. Uh, Rather, he wants to describe and explain our moral practices. But at the end, right, he says something very interesting, and we'll come back to this at the end of our course of Hume lectures. But at the end, he says, look, once this explanation is set up and understood, you'll be all the more pleased to make it, okay? And it's clear that this being pleased to make the moral judgments that we in fact make, it's clear that this pleasure is a kind of moral approbation. So even though, right, his project's fundamentally explanatory, he thinks in the end it's an explanation that ends up self-vindicating what it seeks to explain. It provides a kind of moral justification. Now, that's just a hint. We're not really ready to completely understand the self-vindicatory character of Hume's explanation of morals, but I just wanted to point that out now. He's one thing that might be going on with the ought claim might be looking to this discussion at the end of book 3. He also might be looking towards backwards to the end of book 1. And remember, the end of book 1 ends with a note of skeptical despair. And what Hume despaired of, right, was our ever coming to understand the super sensible natures of things. Okay, That's what he's skeptical about. And uh, given that reason in exceeding its proper role, right, gets ourselves into trouble, right, when it tries to speculate about the supersensible natures of things, right, it's better really for its activity to be confined to its proper offices. And so that thought might also be playing a role here. Um, Now, I think the second worry about the argument's persuasiveness is really a more important worry. And the worry here is this. You might say, hey, fine, Hume, given reason as you conceive of it, reason so conceived couldn't determine the will, but that's not how reason is properly conceived, right? Properly conceived, it is among the determinants of the will, right? So the point here is that, look, if you come to this discussion with a richer conception of reason than Hume's, this argument, though valid, might not be persuasive, right? Because you might deny that reason is the proper operation of reason is confined to these two functions, to demonstrate truths and to render probable the relation of cause and effect. Now, Hume recognizes this difficulty, okay, and he's going to provide a subsidiary argument. Uh, and Before I talk about this subsidiary argument, I want to pause and talk about um, what you should be thinking about when you're reading things, okay? Uh, Look, if your goal is to establish some truth, all you need is one argument, right? If that argument's sound, if its premises are true and the argument is valid, right, that argument is going to be sufficient to establish that truth, right? So when an author gives multiple arguments, you've got to ask, why are they giving multiple arguments? Now, they could do so for many reasons. Sometimes, right, giving multiple arguments is revealing different aspects of the subject matter under discussion. In this case, however, right, Hume is giving an additional argument because of a perceived weakness of the prior one, right? So this additional argument is not going to be subject to the difficulty concerning the persuasiveness of the prior argument. And that's the reason in this instance, we're getting more than one argument for the same conclusion. But the important learning thing for you all is that make sure when you see an author giving multiple arguments for the same conclusion, ask yourselves, why are they doing that? Well, when we do, in the case of Hume, we see he's giving an argument that's not susceptible to a difficulty that the first argument was. Okay, so what is this argument? Well, Hume asks, here's how to think about it. Hume asks, how could a passion be inconsistent or be in conflict with reason? And his thought was, well, a passion might be in conflict with reason if it was inconsistent with a truth determined by reason. So if reason discovers some truth, and this truth that reason discovers is somehow or another inconsistent with a passion, right? Uh, 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 that's how reason can conflict, right, with the passions, okay? Now, Hume's second thought here is, well, the only way something can conflict with a truth discovered by reason is if, like a truth discovered by reason, it was a representation. and it represented something inconsistent with the truth discovered by reason. Okay. So if Hume can argue that passions don't represent anything, then it's going to follow that passions can't contradict a truth discovered by reason, and hence they can't be contrary to reason. So that's the overall structure of the argument. And the way he puts it is that the passions lack a representative quality. Okay. Again, all that means is they don't represent anything. They don't even represent their objects. And since they don't represent anything, they can't be inconsistent with um, a truth discovered by reason. Now, why does Hume think the passions lack a representative quality and hence don't represent anything, not even their objects? Well, um, recall the passions are original existences, right? Um, they're not copies of anything else that occurs in the mind, okay? And the way mental representation works for Hume is via the mechanism of copying. Okay. Why does my idea of red represent redness? Because it's a copy of my impression of redness. Okay. Uh, so, in order for something to be a representation, it has to be a copy. Passions are original existences and hence copies of no other thing. So it follows on Hume's metaphysics that passions aren't representations, and hence they can't represent something that contradicts a truth discovered by reason. And uh, uh, there you go. Okay. Now notice this argument, right, didn't appeal to the claim that reason's operations were limited to discovering, demonstrating truths and rendering probable the relation of cause and effect. Okay. So any doubts you might have about whether reason its functions are confined to those two, right, aren't doubts about this argument, right? Because this argument doesn't tell us about what the functions of reason are, right? It's rather an argument that the passions lack a representative quality and hence can't contradict a truth discovered by reason. Um, right. So um, now, um, Hume's going to make a minor concession, okay, at this point. Um, um, uh, and the minor concession is going to be that uh, there are going to be cases where we can criticize a passion, okay? So when the passion's based on a false belief, for example, right? So when you're afraid of something that's not in fact dangerous, right? He thinks that's criticizable. And when a choice of means to passion's ends is unreasonable, right? When you try to achieve something, but it doesn't have the expected effect, right? But he thinks these concessions really don't make a huge amount of difference because when a passion is not founded on a false supposition, I'm reading Hume now, nor chooses means insufficient to the end, the understanding can neither justify nor condemn it. And now we're going to see that um, uh, um, uh, this is going to uh, raise, uh, we're going to see Hume make some rather remarkable claims. And let me just stop this for a moment. So we're going to see um, uh, in an extraordinary passage, Hume makes some claims that might seem initially outrageous. Okay, now I'm prefacing this because uh, um, uh, uh, um, 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 I'm prefacing this uh, with some remarks because we got to ask ourselves what on earth, right, is going on here? Okay, so let me just read you this passage, right? He says, it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. 'Tis not contrary to reason for me to choose my total ruin to prevent the least uneasiness of a person wholly unknown to me. 'Tis as little contrary as reason to prefer even my acknowledged lesser good to my greater, and to have a more ardent affection for the former than the latter. A trivial good may, from certain circumstances, produce a desire superior to what arises from the greatest and most valuable in enjoyment, nor is there anything more extraordinary in this than in mechanics to see a 1 pound weight raise up 100 by the advantage of its situation. Okay, again, I think that Hume is being deliberatively provocative, right? Look, it may not be contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the entire world to the scratching of my finger in the strict and philosophical sense of reason. But look, there's another sense familiar from to the vulgar in which it would be utterly mad, insane to prefer this, right? Now, I think Hume is inviting this response, right? He's deliberately trying to get a rise out of his reader, right? He's kind of trolling his reader here, right? He's inviting this response because it's setting up a kind of diagnosis that he's interested in. And so let me pause and just go over a couple distinctions about the passions, because these are going to be relevant to the Humean diagnosis that's going on in the background of this extraordinary passage. So let me share the screen again, and let me switch the slide. Okay. First of all, we need a distinction between calm and violent passions. This is this distinction's drawn, he says, in terms of the turbulence and felt intensity of these passions. And the turbulence and felt intensity of the passions is, of course, a matter of degree, and this is something Hume acknowledges. So this is not a really precise distinction. And uh, violent passions, right, are strongly felt, and they have a tendency to occasion disorder, right? That's the sense in which they're turbulent. Calm passions are not strongly felt and are, he says, are more known by their effects than any accompanying emotion. And they don't have, they aren't turbulent. They don't tend to occasion disorder. So, for example, anger would be an example of a violent passion, right? When you're angry, right, it's unmistakable. It's unmistakable given the kind of the content of what you're feeling at that moment, right? So you know you're angry by the felt emotion, and we're all familiar with how anger can prompt us to do things that we might later regret, right? So it has a tendency to occasion disorder, right? Um, And it affects our concentration as well, right? When you're angry, right, it's hard to keep focus on something else, right? You keep thinking about whatever it is that you're angry about. Benevolence, however, or kindness, these, according to Hume, are calm emotions. When you're kind, uh, kindness operates, he thinks, with little felt emotion, and it doesn't have the same tendency to occasion disorder the way anger does. Okay. Um, so we need this distinction between calm and violent emotions, and these pertain to the nature of the emotions, right? So anger is by nature a violent passion, benevolence, kindness, those things are by nature calm passions, okay? Now, Hume's thought is this. Think about the calm passions, right? The calm passions operate with little sensible emotion and are more known by their effects than by how they feel. Okay. Uh, and so we're liably not, we're liable to miss whatever emotion there is to feel. Okay. It's so low level. Okay. And Hume thinks that given this, we have a tendency to mistake the operation of the calm passions for the operation of reason. Okay, so that's the first important thought going on in Hume's mind. And now, if you go through his examples, right, preferring the destruction of the entire world to the scratching of my finger, preferring my my ruin, preferring my own ruin to prevent the least uneasiness in a person wholly unknown to me. All of those cases involve preferring a either a lesser good to a greater good, or it involves, or it's going to involve uh, preferring a greater evil to a lesser evil. Okay, um, and now, um, if you look at the text, right, among the calm passions is the general appetite for the good over the evil. Okay, uh, and in each of these examples, right, a strong, violent emotion has disrupted the operation of this calm passion, right, the general appetite for good rather than evil. Uh, and Hume's diagnosis is, in effect, that, well, look, philosophers and the vulgar alike have mistaken the operation of calm passions for the operation of reason. And what the vulgar and earlier philosophers portray as the combat between reason and the passions, that's just not possible. But what they were really mistakenly or misleadingly describing was a different thing, a conflict between two kinds of passions, the violent ones and the calm passions. Okay. So that's the Humean diagnosis. Um, and I think that's what's going on in this extraordinary passage. Okay, so at this point, we've looked at two arguments, for um, that reason can't determine the will, and neither can oppose the passion's determination of the will, right? We had the argument from reason's proper office. It's limited to two, and neither of those are going to determine the will. And we had the argument from the fact that reason was uh, the argument from the fact that passions lack a representative quality and hence could not conflict with a truth discovered by reason. So those were the two arguments. Um, uh, Now, I want to, at this point, make the connection between this result in philosophical psychology and begin to apply it to the discussion of ethics uh, um, in book 3. Now, remember the elements of Hume's metaphysics of mind, right? So whatever is present to the mind is a perception, and perceptions are either impressions or ideas, depending on their relative force or vivacity. And Hume's going to, with that in mind, Hume's going to raise the following question. He says, whether it's by means of our ideas or impressions that we distinguish between vice and virtue and pronounce an action blameworthy or praiseworthy. Okay, couple remarks about this. First, virtue and vice. We tend nowadays not to talk about virtue and vice, but that's not to say that we don't operate with these concepts, right? Think about evaluative descriptions of people's character. If you dismiss somebody as being a jerk, right, you're attributing to them, in Hume's terminology, a vicious character. Okay. Now, so, but despite being kind of quaint and old-fashioned, right, we have to be careful here because Hume's talking about virtue and vice. He's not talking about right or wrong or good or bad, and there's a reason for that. Uh, so, in general, I want to suggest to you to note authors' choice of terminology and always ask yourself whether that's doing some work. Okay. In the case of Hume, talking about virtue and vice isn't stylistic, right? We'll see why as we in subsequent lectures. Okay. So the second thing I want to point out about this quote, remember, the quote was asking whether it's by means of our ideas or impressions that we distinguish between vice and virtue. Now, Hume's regarding this as a more precise question than the one that divided a certain traditional debate between rationalists and sentimentalists. Okay, so you had some authors, rationalists, such as Malebranche or Clarke or Cudworth. They thought, right, we distinguish between vice and virtue on the basis of reason. Okay. And moral sentimentalists thought that moral distinctions weren't determined by reason, but rather by internal sentiment, by the passions, by things like desires or emotions. Okay. Uh, so the way Hume is going to interpret this debate is that the rationalists, given Hume's metaphysics of mind, have to think that moral distinctions are demonstrable on the basis of the relations among ideas. Whereas uh, um, whereas uh, moral sentimentalists are going to deny that moral distinctions are derived from reason. Rather, they're determined not by demonstrating them on the basis of the relations of ideas, but rather by demonstrating them they're determined by certain impressions, right? The passions. Now, uh, one thing to ask yourself is is the Humean specification of this question that uh, informed this traditional debate is he changing the subject, or is this an okay specification? I leave that just for you to think about. Okay, let's get the slide up. Right. Um, right. Um, okay, now, uh, Hume thinks he's got a pretty quick argument in favor of sentimentalism. Okay, all right. And it's going to exploit this result in his philosophical psychology from book 2. Okay. The result, of course, is that concerns reason's impotence, the fact that it alone can't determine the will, nor can it alone oppose the passion's determination of the will. He's going to muster that claim into an argument for moral sentimentalism. And uh, well, how's it going to go? Right? Well, we'll just use that result in philosophical psychology as a premise. It's going to be our initial premise, right? That's the bullet point in the present slide, first bullet point of the present slide. And he's going to conjoin that with a claim that, moral distinctions influence our passions and actions, right? So if you think, for example, a course of action is vicious and would be blameworthy on that account, there's going to be a natural tendency, not a tendency, a natural tendency for you not to do it. We are at least sometimes moved to act by the moral distinctions that we make. Okay, perhaps not all the time. Uh, Perhaps we can recognize a course of action as vicious, but we're moved by some violent emotion to pursue that course of action nonetheless. So Hume's not claiming we're angels. Rather, he's just making the rather quotidian claim that at least sometimes moral distinctions can move us to act. Okay. And he's basing that just on cautious observation of human affairs. Okay. And there's something to that. A lot of contemporary philosophers believe something similar. Okay. Well, now look what's going to follow, right? Uh, if our moral distinctions can influence passions and actions, and reason alone can't influence passions and actions, it seems that reason alone can't determine the moral distinctions, right? Uh, uh, they don't have the right sort of motivational efficacy. Okay, so in a way, that's Hume's main argument for um, for sentimentalism. Okay, now let me see. Um, when he gives this argument, he also repeats, the consideration about the passions lacking a representative quality in order to bolster the first premise of this argument. He also gives a battery of subsidiary arguments, but this is conceptually is really the main argument. This is what's driving Hume sentimentalism. And we'll talk precisely about what sentimentalism amounts to in Hume in the next lecture. But I want to talk about a second argument that Hume gives. This is his main argument. This is what's really moving him, but he gives a second argument as well. Now, this second argument he describes as a piece of abstruse reasoning that's more likely to silence critics than persuade them. And what I would like to do in the time remaining is just go over the second argument so you have an idea about its structure, okay? Now, I'm not expecting you to master this argument. It's abstract, and as Hume himself observes, it's not very persuasive. However, next lecture, we're going to discuss some examples that Hume talks about, and these examples, excuse me, these examples dramatize, right, this abstract argument. And even if you're, in the end, can't get this abstract argument under your belt, it's really useful to go over the abstract argument as a primer to get you ready to read and understand Hume's discussion of the examples. So again, in the time remaining, I want to just quickly talk about the general structure of this overall argument. It's just a footnote for those who might go on to study more ethics. This is going to be the historical source for a famous argument promulgated by John Mackey in the 70s called the argument from queerness. The argument from queerness is, in effect, Mackey's take on or development of this specific abstract argument of Hume's. Okay, so let's consider then this abstruse piece of reasoning. Okay, so um, Hume's going to say, look, you're a rationalist. He's going to say to his rationalist opponent, look, Mr. Rationalist or Ms. Rationalist or whoever, right? Look, rationalist, right? You think moral distinctions are demonstrable on the basis of reasoning. They say yes. And he's like, good. Hume then says, well, if they're demonstrable on the basis of reason, right, we should be able to demonstrate them on the basis of the relation among ideas. And the rationalists might agree. Now, Hume himself is getting this talk from a rationalist, right? He's getting it from Malebranche. So at least one one rationalist, Malebranche, would concede thus far, right? And now Hume's going to say, well, look, I think we can only demonstrate certain truths based on resemblance and on the following list of relations. Okay, the details aren't going to matter a huge amount for now, but he says the relations that on the basis of which we can demonstrate truths are going to be resemblance, contrariety, degrees in quality, and proportion in quantity and number. And he says, look, so if moral distinctions are demonstrable, right, they're going to have to be demonstrable on these relations. But he's going to suggest that you can't demonstrate them on the basis of these relations. Okay. Now, it's the second stage of the argument that's going to be the interesting bit. Now, of course, you know what the rationalist is going to respond is going is by saying, well, of course, moral distinctions are demonstrable on the basis of some relation not on your list. Okay. So, for example, one moral rationalist, Clark, speaks of the relation of fittingness of an action to the circumstances in which it was performed. Maybe that's the relation. And so what Hume is going to do now is impose some criteria for an adequate relation. He's going to say, uh, um, uh, 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 he's going to specify some conditions that a relation is going to have to satisfy in order to play this role that it's meant to play according to the rationalist, right? Uh, um, um, now, uh, he's going to suggest that these relations have to obtain between perceptions in the mind and um, and objects in the environment. Um, and he's going to, let's see, there we go. Uh, uh, and that's going to be the first requirement. And the second requirement is that the relations being demonstrable, right, these are going to be, as it were, knowable a priori and cause everyone to that knows them to act virtuously to the same degree. Now he's going to argue that these two conditions cannot be met. Now, look, if you have no idea about the significance of the first condition, that will become really super duper obvious when we talk about Hume's examples, right? So I'm going to hold off until next lecture talking about that. Uh, um, and in effect, what he's going to suggest is that, well, look, any relation you can pick, there's no reason to think that relation couldn't obtain among perceptions alone or among external objects alone. And so is going to violate this first condition, okay? Uh, as far as the second condition, um, uh, he thinks that uh, uh, even though, uh, even if something were demonstrable on the basis of these relations among the ideas, right? Uh, they're not going to move everyone equally, right? Again, because of uh, his worries about the motivational inefficacy of reason. Okay, I understand that was pretty abstract. Again, I, my goal is not to present you a full dress defense of this second argument, but rather just to sketch its bare outlines, right? Um, uh, Again, because as a primer for Hume's discussion of the examples, which we will begin by talking about next time. Um, and the issue about anticipating Mackey has to do, for those who are interested, has to do with the argument for why the second condition is not going to be met. So for those who are interested in that, that's the source. And if you're super duper interested in that, Mackey himself wrote a little book on Hume's ethics, and his discussion of this argument is revealing. Okay, so um, uh, again, what we did today is look at this central claim in philosophical psychology that reason alone can never determine the will nor oppose the passion's determination of the will. We looked at two arguments for that. And then we looked at how Hume leveraged this result in philosophical psychology in an argument for moral sentimentalism. Okay. Now, next time we're going to talk about the examples. We're going to talk about how Hume is thinking about moral sentimentalism in general, and we're going to begin and we're going to talk about this important distinction between natural and artificial virtues. Okay, all that's happening next time, and looking ahead. uh, um, we're the main thing I want to talk about are the artificial virtues, and I'm going to just talk about one of them, which is the virtue of justice. Okay, um, and that's where you're really going to see Hume's ethical philosophy doing some interesting work in his discussion of the artificial virtues. Okay, so that by way of advertisement. I'll upload this lecture later on this afternoon if you came in late, so don't worry, you haven't missed anything. And that's it for today. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time this morning, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.